Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. This story is about a virus, but probably not the one you're expecting. But let's start by looking at the thickness of yesterday's Arctic ice. The ice around the North Pole is 2 to 3 meters thick, and there's some pretty thick ice not far from the coast of Alaska. But on this date 13 years ago, the Arctic was very different. There was no ice in the Beaufort Sea off the coast of Alaska, and the ice around the North Pole was very thin. Norway's leading expert predicted that the Arctic was going to become ice-free during the summer of 2008. Canada's leading expert predicted that the North Pole may be free of ice for the first time in history. Based on these expert predictions, British swimmer Lewis Pugh tried to kayak to the North Pole. He planned to kayak about 500 miles, but got blocked by the ice after only 20. This is what happens when you listen to the world's leading climate experts and the BBC. Other experts were a little bit more conservative and said the Arctic wouldn't be ice-free until 2012. The US Navy and the BBC said the Arctic wouldn't be ice-free until 2013. And Nobel laureate Al Gore was even more conservative. He gave the Arctic until the year 2014. And here we are 13 years later with Arctic ice extent the highest it's been in many years. And the ice is much thicker now than it was 13 years ago. I got interested in this climate clown show about 15 years ago. And 13 years ago this week, I wrote this article in the Register. The experts were predicting an ice-free Arctic that summer, and I pointed out that what they were saying was complete nonsense. I wrote under a pen name at that time because I knew the company I was working for would probably fire me if they found out I was a climate skeptic. Now let's fast forward 3 years to 2011 in beautiful Lisbon, Portugal. I was invited to a European Union climate conference. It was the first time I came out in public as a climate skeptic. And when I returned to Colorado, the large engineering company I'd been working for 5 years walked me out the door the next day. Telling the truth about climate is extremely expensive. I would be retired right now if I was willing to allow these climate lies to proceed. So a few weeks later in 2011, I took a software contract in Sandy Hook, Connecticut. Not very long after that, Sandy Hook became very famous for all the wrong reasons. On my way to the office, I would ride my bicycle right past Sandy Hook Elementary School. Now let's fast forward 5 years to 2016. This was Washington, D.C. at the premiere of Marc Morano's movie Climate Hustle. That's Marc Morano, David Legates, Sarah Palin, and Brent Bozell. That was also my Hollywood premiere. For one night, we were the top Hollywood box office. 2016 was a very eventful year. My good friend and climate hero, Dr. Bill Gray, passed away. He grew up in Washington, D.C. and competed with Warren Buffett for who had the best Washington Post paper route. Bill consistently made more money than Warren Buffett did selling papers. But Bill took a very different route from Warren Buffett. Bill chose to be an honest academic, and it ended up costing him millions of dollars. Dr. Gray was the leading tropical meteorologist in the world, but Vice President Al Gore cut off his funding in 1993 because Dr. Gray refused to go along with Al Gore's scam. Dr. Gray largely self-funded his graduate students for the next 30 years. Bill was probably the greatest man I ever met, and he's my hero and my inspiration. Then in May of 2016, I ended up working in Burlington, Vermont. One day while I was there, I had the pleasure of sitting next to Bernie Sanders' campaign manager, and I live tweeted him trashing the DNC and Debbie Wasserman. You might remember that the DNC stole the nomination from Bernie Sanders and gave it to Hillary Clinton, which is how the DNC now runs all elections. This was my home south of Burlington in Shelburne. I was getting paid a pretty good salary to camp out in Vermont for the summer. A few weeks later in June, I found myself in Scotland at the Monty Python Castle. And this was the spectacular Aberdeenshire coast near Donald Trump's golf course. At the end of June, I found myself celebrating Brexit with the Wayman family in South Wiltshire. That was 5 years ago when we were still naive enough to believe that elections made any difference. June of 2016 was a very fun time for me, but July wasn't. A couple of days after I returned to the United States, I came down with a horrible virus. I got pneumonia, had intestinal bleeding, and numerous other serious health problems. On July 4th, I flew to Washington, D.C., and when I got there, I realized that there was a pretty good chance I wasn't going to be able to make it back home. The next morning, I got on the first flight I could, and over the next 30 days, I lost 25 pounds. I still had some breathing difficulties from that virus for 2 years. My ex-wife is a physician, and she believed the virus was probably weaponized. Her husband caught the same thing, and at one point he was within a couple hours of being dead. Anyway, I did recover, but I knew I was going to lose my job, which I did. I made the decision not to pay my 2015 taxes because I knew I was going to need the cash to survive. I was unable to pay the taxes for several years, but last spring I got a funding source which allowed me to pay off my debt to the IRS. I thought we were all settled up, but last week I got a letter from the IRS demanding 60% penalties on those taxes, which I paid a year ago. And I've gotten several threatening letters from them in the last week. It seems pretty likely they're targeting me over my politics, which is the way they operated the last time Biden was in the White House. Anyway, I had to give up my funding source last year in order to continue telling the truth, and so did my wife, Kyrie. We depend on you to keep us moving forward and telling the truth. I don't like to ask for help, but every few years we need to make an appeal. Kyrie and I would greatly appreciate it if you could visit realclimatescience.com and make a donation on our PayPal button. And of course, Toto, Kyrie, and Caesar would be greatly appreciative as well. 100 years ago, Arctic sea ice was rapidly disappearing. But over the past 13 years, Arctic ice has refused to cooperate with climate alarmists. Please visit all of us on the web at realclimatescience.com. And thanks again for your amazing encouragement and support.
He's a great guy. He's never advertised on his channel, and this is the first time I heard him ask for anything. Oh, I can't turn this off. Anyway, I'll probably chip in something to Tony Heller. He's a great guy.